Hi and welcome. I'm Eric Tars. I'm the Legal Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, and we are excited to welcome you to this installment in our webinar series on homelessness during COVID-19. Now more than ever, we need to be talking about the human right to housing and how we can hold our government accountable for failures in this regard. And that's why I'm thrilled to bring our all-star team together to help us talk about what is going on and why it's important for us to be doing human rights advocacy, and why and how you can make it part of your strategies. I will start out with a few words about the kind of difference a human rights advocacy can make, and then move on to Carrie, who can talk about the upcoming Universal Periodic Review, where the U.S. will have its human rights record reviewed by the UN Human Rights Council, and give you all the details on what it is, why it's important, and how you can get involved. Then David will bring us through how advocates in Miami are using the process, and Rob will close us out with some of the national picture and what he's been doing, talking with folks around the globe to put focus on the U.S.'s record. And we should end up with plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Although participants cannot speak during this webinar, you will see on your sidebar a comment box in which you can type your questions, and which will be read at the end of the presentation, and we'll be able to respond to them. Just type them in as the webinar goes along. Anything that we can't get back to, we will follow up afterwards. So just type it in, and one way or another, we'll get you an answer. Also, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted later, so if you have any concerns about identifying yourself, just please be aware of that. You will be able to view the webinar again and share it with anybody who you want to share it with. If you registered and are on the webinar now, then a link will be automatically sent to you once we get it up afterwards, but you can also find it at nlchp.org/webinars. And last but not least, while I don't normally encourage multitasking during presentations, if you just have itchy Twitter fingers and want to share some of the brilliant points soon to be made by our presenters, please do tag us at NLCHP Homeless, and our presenters' Twitter handles will be on the slides as we introduce them. But first, I just want to start with a little thought experiment. Imagine a person forced to sleep on a cold concrete slab, exposed to the elements, sleep deprived, denied adequate food and water, humiliated and degraded, threatened and harassed by law enforcement. Got that picture in your head? I've got a picture in my head too. And when it's these pictures, it's no doubt that it's a human rights violation, right? But now, thanks to our advocacy and the work of folks like Rob and Carrie and David, when it's this one, it is now recognized as such, not only at the international level, but through some of the recommendations that we got through the previous Universal Periodic Review in 2015, but it's also recognized at the domestic level, where even now we still have HUD acknowledging criminalization of homelessness violates not just our constitutional obligations, but our international human rights obligations. And HUD has turned that recognition into important grant incentives that advocates have used in their communities to help stop the criminalization of homelessness. And the Department of Justice submitted a brief in our 8th Amendment Bell, now Martin versus Boise case, affirming our position that criminalizing basic life-sustaining conduct violates the Constitution, and which the DOJ later stated was an acknowledgement of our human rights obligations as well. And that advocacy then in turn helped create a decision from the Ninth Circuit that is making a difference in the lives of people experiencing homelessness all across the country. People are sleeping safer tonight because of our human rights work at the international level, which we then brought back into our domestic advocacy. and we have changed the baseline of the conversation on the issue of criminalization from the federal level down to the local, so everyone from federal officials to local advocates are able to use these standards to help prevent people from being punished for not having a home to live in. But the right not to be punished for sleeping on the streets isn't our end goal. Our end goal is the human right to housing for everyone. And I'm not endorsing any specific candidates here, but this spring, through our human rights advocacy, we got Senator Warren directly calling housing a human right. And we also got Senator Booker, and Senator Harris, and Senator Sanders, and Secretary Castro even led his platform with it. And now we've got, for the first time since Franklin Roosevelt, a major party presidential candidate calling housing a right. And the full story of how this all happened is in our 10-step guide to human rights advocacy on our website and can be found in some of our previous webinars on there as well. So I'm not going to go into more detail now. But the point I'm trying to make is that we have made human rights strategies an active and productive part of our advocacy, and it's making a difference in the everyday lives of people experiencing homelessness in the U.S. and it's leading us to a human rights approach to policy. And so that's all the good news of the change that we've made so far. But we all know that the U.S. still has a long way to go and many human rights abuses to be held accountable for. And for that reason, I'm thrilled now to turn it over to Carrie McLean, the UPR coordinator at the U.S. Human Rights Network, of which the Law Center is a founding member and an organization I'm proud to serve on the board of. Ms. McLean is an international human rights lawyer and international development consultant. Over the past 16 years, she's lived in Africa, Europe, and Asia, working with local and international organizations on human rights and international development, engaging in significant UN advocacy, including litigation with treaty monitoring bodies, writing shadow reports concerning compliance with multiple treaties, and working with UN special rapporteurs. Ms. McLean has served as an election observer in Cambodia, Honduras, Venezuela, El Salvador, and Abkhazia. She's also served as a trial observer in Turkey for trials involving persecuted lawyers and human rights defenders. She's provided training on and delivered lectures on international human rights in the U.S. and other parts of the world, and we are so privileged to have her with us today. Carrie, can you take us through what the periodic review is and how we can use it?
Thank you so much, Eric. So as Eric mentioned, I'm coordinating the Universal Periodic Review work for the U.S. Human Rights Network. The U.S. Human Rights Network is a network of over 300 member and partner organizations coordinating U.S. civil society's engagement with international bodies. Today, I'm going to talk about doing advocacy concerning the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review. I want to talk about this in a holistic way, so I'll begin with a bit of an overview. In 2006, the UN Commission on Human Rights was reorganized into the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is an intergovernmental body within the UN composed of 47 countries. The council meets regularly to review the status of human rights in countries around the world. The UPR was established by the UN as a process by which the human rights record of each UN member state is reviewed by their peers. The UPR is a 3-hour interactive dialogue facilitated by the UPR Working Group, which is the 47 members of the Human Rights Council, between a government delegation from the country under review, and in this case, the US, and other UN member countries. Countries submit written questions to the government being reviewed before the in-person dialogue. At the beginning of the review session, the government delegation has the opportunity to speak, and they usually describe the human rights conditions in the country and respond to any questions submitted in advance. During the dialogue, any UN member country can ask questions and make comments and recommendations to the country that's being reviewed. Recommendations are a really important component of the review because the country under review has to respond to each one. The USA's UPR review will take place on Monday, November 9th. This is the US's third UPR review. It was reviewed in 2010 and 2015. There are 139 reports from civil society organizations submitted to the UN last October in preparation for the UPR. The reports describe urgent human rights issues in the US. The UPR process has several stages, and there are opportunities for civil society to get involved at each stage. So there's the government's report and national consultations. The government being reviewed is supposed to prepare a national report assessing its human rights record, including progress and challenges since its last review. That report is then submitted to the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council has encouraged countries to prepare their reports through a broad consultative process at the national level. Many countries hold national consultations with civil society organizations as they prepare their national reports. Under the previous administration, the US government had UPR working groups focused on different issue areas and held periodic civil society consultations to receive input and provide updates on progress, but that didn't happen under this administration. I'm only aware of 2 consultations with civil society during this UPR process. The government recently submitted its report to the UN, apparently sometime in August. The report contains numerous misrepresentations, and there are important omissions. So the input from civil society is absolutely critical in painting a picture on the situation in the United States. Civil society organizations should research, write, and submit reports on human rights issues occurring in the country under review. The UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights prepares a summary of those reports. That office will also prepare a compilation of any relevant information about the country's human rights record from other UN bodies. The review of the country will take into account the country's national report, the summary of reports, and a compilation of information from various UN bodies. So many reports are sent by civil society organizations, and therefore every issue is not going to make it into the UN's report summary. This is why lobbying is really important. Through lobbying, advocates might be able to make sure that their issues are raised during the interactive dialogue. Before COVID, some civil society organizations could attend the review session in person, but civil society organizations cannot speak during the review. So the only way to have your questions asked or your recommendations made is through the governments that you lobby. Lobbying can take place at embassies in the US and at the government missions in Geneva. Lobbying begins months before the review actually takes place. Because of COVID, we've been organizing and participating in virtual briefings where advocates meet with representatives of governments from around the world to inform them about human rights issues in advance of the review. So as I mentioned, the review of the US will take place on Monday, November 9th. You can watch the review on UN TV. Even if you don't watch it live, you can watch the recording afterwards. I encourage all of you to watch and try to encourage people within your networks to watch. For more information about the UPR and about the US Human Rights Network's UPR work, please visit our website at upr2020.org. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carrie. And we will definitely follow up to hear more about how groups who may not have been participating in the process yet can still get involved and still be able to use the process for their own advocacy.
Okay.
But now we'll turn it over to David Stuzen, a clinical fellow with the University of Miami Human Rights Clinic and the digital editor of the University of Miami Law Review. Within the clinic, David's work has been primarily focused on researching strategies for translating international human rights standards into federal, state, and local implementation within the U.S. He was previously a research assistant for both Professor Stephen Schnably and Professor Tamar Azer, working in both positions on issues affecting the rights of people experiencing homelessness in the city of Miami. David helped to prepare a report to the Human Rights Council for advocates in Miami, and he'll lead us through that process and how they hope to use the results from the upcoming UPR as part of their advocacy strategies. David?
Thanks, Eric. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about why it's worth preparing a local stakeholder report, even when there's a national report or a bunch of other reports going in. So there's a general reason. One is that particularly within Miami, within Florida, there have been a lot of state and federal appeals to deal with criminalization of homelessness. But given that our clinic actually has a lot of expertise in the international arena, we thought that looking at what the National Homelessness Law Center has been able to accomplish in getting recommendations through the UPR system on the national level, we thought we could try and bring those successes home to the local level in Miami-Dade County. Miami also has a history of being open to these kinds of arguments. It is a CDAW county. We passed the CDAW ordinance, which basically allows for a committee to investigate instances of gender discrimination within Miami-Dade County. So we know that there is some openness to it, and those arguments might be useful if we had a recommendation. A little more of a specific reason is that in 2019, a major consent decree that existed in Miami called the Pottinger Consent Decree was dissolved by a federal court order. The consent decree effectively allowed, when it was in place, had allowed people experiencing homelessness in the city of Miami to kind of sleep without being arrested by police officers unless police officers could provide alternative shelter. Unfortunately, it was dissolved, and now there's no easy accountability for any violations of the consent decree. While the underlying law is still good, litigation is expensive, and we really wanted to look for ways that we could hold the city accountable, which would require getting legislation, would require getting local officials actually involved in the process of helping people experiencing homelessness rather than penalizing them for being homeless. And we've seen this summer a huge ramp up. I'm sure many of you have seen this in our area of policies against people experiencing homelessness. We saw encampment suites during COVID, which go against CDC recommendations. We've seen a food sharing ordinance that restricts how frequently meal providers can distribute meals. And we've even seen Miami Beach hired a special prosecutor who largely enforces misdemeanors against people experiencing homelessness. And while we'd like the Pottinger Consent Decree to be back in place, we also want to go further. As Eric mentioned earlier, the ultimate goal is to have positive rights for everyone, including a right to adequate housing and healthcare. And so we really wanted to reach out to the UN system and the UN Human Rights Network, because the treaties really have the treaties and the instruments within the Human Rights Network have a lot of rich language that we can use to advocate for rights beyond what are allowed at the local level. So we decided to do UPR because it's very easy for civil societies to submit. We knew there was a national report going, and submitting local reports can really help bolster the national report because it's providing local instances of what the national report is talking about. And it also helps put a spotlight on our Miami-Dade County specific issues. Our report focused pretty holistically on the issues, and we sort of addressed it in 3 sections. So we had a section on criminalization, and then we had 2 sections on sort of positive rights, so right to health and right to housing. And we argued that the Miami-Dade County was really falling short of all of those obligations. And we looked at the various ways Miami-Dade County is falling short, and we tried to tie them to specific treaty language, and even instruments that aren't necessarily binding, like treaties like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. While the US has a complicated relationship with a lot of these treaties and how they get actually adopted into law, they're, as the National Law Center has shown, they can be really helpful in pushing for normative values and applying pressure on officials. And we definitely hope to do that here. Another great thing about the UPR process is that a report is really strengthened when you submit it as a partner report. Partner reports are allowed to be a bit longer than single submissions. And it's great because it shows a coalition of people in an area, and that adds strength to your report. So we reached out to a lot of groups in the area who are working on disparate issues. And this was a great opportunity to connect people and to connect ourselves as the clinic into these groups. We're actually working on a lot of projects with them apart from the UPR. But it also helped coordinate a statement of the main issues of Miami-Dade County and really bring people on board. And finally, it educated a lot of people in our community about the International Human Rights Network, which they didn't even know existed. And I think what Eric was saying earlier is that we really want to change this into a human rights issue and get people, not change it, but make people see that it is a human rights issue and use that language, because that really changes the framing of things on the ground in Miami, as well as anywhere else. So once we submitted it, we really had to make sure that we were continuing to promote it and advocate it. So it's really not enough to just submit it. You need to make sure to talk to get it in front of as many stakeholders as possible. So what we did is we first followed up the report by coming up with condensed fact sheets of our report, which would make it easy for people to sort of look at it without having to read the report in depth. These are all very busy people that we're showing it to, and so the easier you make it to understand your main points, the more effective that advocacy will be. We also followed it up with specific fact sheets on COVID-19 and racialized policing, which are big issues that have national attention, but also have international attention on them, and they will be things that will be addressed in the UPR. And since they fit into this topic so well, we thought these fact sheets really bolstered our UPR report. We then sent all of our fact sheets to UPR Info, which is an NGO based in Geneva, which focuses on strengthening engagement in the UPR process, and they distributed our fact sheets to a lot of country missions in Geneva. We collaborated with colleagues that were hosting a public event for country missions in Geneva. They were focusing on the right to food, but we highlighted a lot of the intersections between the right to food and the right to housing. And in the lead up to that event, we made sure our fact sheets were including in the briefing packets the country missions had. And then we've been working sort of on the local level in terms of engaging with our local German consulate in Miami. We reached out to Germany, the German consulate, because Germany is one of the 3 countries in the Troika that will be facilitating the UPR review of the US. And we reach out to other country missions and hope to have some opportunity to brief them over the next couple of weeks. And finally, we've continued to reach out to more advocacy groups in our area beyond the ones that we just originally partnered with, because again, the more people that you can bring into this process, the more people you can engage in the human rights language and ideas, the more strength you'll have for pushing for advocacy later down the line when recommendations come out and you can push local officials to adopt those recommendations. If we get any recommendations specifically, we really hope to use those as a starting point for dialogue between the advocates and local officials. And like I mentioned before, given that Miami-Dade County is a CDOT county, there's a good opening for engagement, and we're really hoping that in our county mayor election, that our progressive candidate wins, because she was actually one of the principal drafters of the county CDOT ordinance, and so we think her administration will actually be really much more amenable to implementing these kinds of reforms and being open to arguments about universal human rights. So just in sum, the UPR has been really a great tool at the local level for not just bringing together advocacy groups, but also really coalescing our somewhat diverse goals into sort of one project in terms of advancing the rights of housing and the argument against criminalization of homelessness. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, David, for all the work in Miami and for sharing it with us. And we'll look forward to hearing a little bit more during the Q&A as well. But right now, we're going to bring in Rob Robinson to share with our audience once again. Rob's a regular on network or Law Center presentations, and Rob and I go back a long ways. When COVID isn't keeping him at home, Rob is usually globetrotting with homeless advocates in Hungary and squatters in South Africa, the landless in Brazil, and talking with UN officials all along the way. Rob was a co-founder and a member of the leadership committee of the Take Back the Land movement and is currently a staff volunteer at Partners for Dignity and Rights, formerly known as NESRI. After losing his job in 2001, he spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City shelter. He eventually overcame homelessness and has been in the housing movement based in New York City since 2007. In the fall of 2009, Rob was chosen to be the New York City chairperson for the first ever official mission to the U.S. of the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing. and he was a member of an advanced team coordinated by the U.S. Human Rights Network in early 2010, traveling to Geneva, Switzerland several times to prepare for one of the previous reviews of the U.S. By the UPR mechanism. He is a regular guest lecturer at the City University Graduate Center and has a working relationship with the New School University, where he helps students develop their thesis projects in a master's degree program in design and urban ecology. Because of his work to turn his own experience of homelessness into advocacy for others, the Law Center awarded Rob its Personal Achievement Award back in 2011, and he hasn't slowed down since. The Law Center helped to produce a report on the national picture of housing and homelessness, and Rob's been the movement's ambassador to the global community, working to make sure that we get strong recommendations from the next UPR. And so Rob's going to bring us up to date on what's going on there. Take it away, Rob.
So thank you, Eric. Beautiful introduction, sort of somewhat unexpected, but I thank you for it. And Eric and I have been working together probably more than a decade, since my days as a member of Picture the Homeless, which goes back to the late 2000s. So thank you very much, Eric. I want to, before I give my presentation, which will be very brief, and how we bring civil society into this work. I was blessed to speak to someone that both Eric and I know real well, a woman by the name of Kelly, who is living on the streets of DC right now. And I want to give a shout out to Kelly because she is also an ambassador from her position, a staunch advocate. So just a shout out to you, Kelly. I know you're probably out there listening, and just want to know that we're recognizing you and thinking about you. So as a longtime member of the U.S. Human Rights Network, along with Eric and many people probably listening in on this call, I had the pleasure of being involved in the very first preparation of the Universal Periodic Review in 2010. And for me, as somebody working as a community organizer and working in civil society, it gave me an opportunity to bring the issues of homelessness and housing directly to the international community, when many people in civil society felt our government wasn't listening or ignoring us. And it was an opportunity for us to bring those problems directly to people in different communities around the world, and have them actually question the U.S. through this Universal Periodic Review. Follow up that, and the issues of racism started to take hold. Not take hold, I guess they were around for years. And I want to be clear about this. I know we tend to focus right now on COVID-19, but a lot of what we're talking about right now has existed since this country was created. So the issues that we're fighting, we've been fighting as long as I was born, Eric was born, David was born, Kerry was born, right? Where, since everybody involved in this issue has been in a struggle probably from the time we came out of a womb, whether we realize it or not, especially people like Kerry and myself, who are people of color and have lived the injustices of a lot of structural racism in the United States. I want to put that out there. But it's an opportunity to bring the voices of civil society directly to the international community. Fast forward to 2014, and there was a lot of work done on structural racism to bring the families directly impacted by police shootings of African-American men and women in the U.S. into that process. But what we learned from the first process, and I particularly learned from Raquel Rolnick's visit as a rapporteur in 2009, is we get output reports that can be used as tools in our daily, day-to-day organizing. And I wasn't so aware of this in the beginning, but as we move through these processes in treaty bodies, understanding what a valuable tool that is. So I think right now, working on housing issues, through COVID-19, when a government issues an edict and says shelter in place, you start to ask yourself, how does that happen for people who are street homeless, right? So a lot of the organizing has happened around that. And I think one of the exceptionalist attitudes the U.S. has had is with respect to what is known around the rest of the world as informal settlements. We will say street homeless here, but when you see a tent city, or you see the tents on the West Coast, or a tent city in a community on the East Coast, those are informal settlements. And it was again through UN processes when Leilani Farha, former UN rapporteur, issued a report in 2018 on informal settlements and included the U.S., it was striking to be able to go to your local governments and say, look what exists in the U.S. that you've been ignoring for a while. So I think the Universal Periodic Review, again, gives us an opportunity to highlight these injustices that exist. I won't go into the formal processes. I think Carrie, Eric, and David in their presentations did a good job of talking about the process and how it actually works. But what I would look forward to after we do this is, all the work we put in talking to missions. I was just a part of a group of 42 missions of the European Union that we did some reporting to. I focus mainly on housing, water, and sanitation. These are big issues that continue to impact people, and particularly people of color in the U.S. I have strong ties to Detroit while they were going through their struggles with water in 2014. We brought that to the UN and got it introduced into the Universal Periodic Review. And those processes are repeating themselves. So whatever obligations the U.S. claimed it was adhering to in 2014 still exist. So we look forward to getting the output from the testimonies that go into this Universal Periodic Review to sort of strengthen our on-the-ground organizing and pushing these issues further into a vision of the world so that we can get reactions from the federal government, hopefully positive. We know our federal government as it exists now is cast aside UN treaty obligations and international human rights law. But if we are fortunate enough to come out of an election with a change at the federal level, we expect that we'll be able to advocate a little bit stronger than we have been able to do in the last 4 years. So looking forward to the results of this Universal Periodic Review, the report that comes out, working closely with the Law Center and the U.S. Human Rights Network to really push our organizing to another level and hope for real structural change within the U.S. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Great. Thanks, Rob. We are, on to our next slide. There we go. So we're happy to take people's questions at this point. I'll just say quickly that this work isn't simple or easy. It does take an investment of resources and just the time to learn about the human rights standards and to think about how it can become part of your advocacy. So there is an investment for sure, but then there's also there's a return on that investment. We've seen some of these struggles really getting internationalized. Rob mentioned the folks in Detroit and Flint talking about water issues there, and when we were able to bring some UN monitors in to kind of have an informal tribunal about those issues, I mean, it got huge media attention and changed the conversation for a lot of the advocates there. We've gotten, as Carrie knows, working with the network, there's been a real effort to bring together many of the parents and relatives of the victims of police violence in the past couple months to bring their concerns to the UN and get the U.S. called out as a human rights violator. And that's helped to strengthen and change the conversation around divestment and defunding the police and investing in human rights, community-based solutions. And this is, as Rob said, this is not a new struggle. This is something that's been going on for a long time. At the end of his life, Martin Luther King was talking about how we have changed from a movement for civil rights to a movement for human rights. And Malcolm X and others in the kind of historical civil rights movements were certainly talking about human rights as a necessary and important next step in the evolution of those movements. That unfortunately many in the civil rights movement lost sight of for several decades, but there's a real push to kind of come back to that now, particularly as the courts and the legislatures domestically are being shut down, this is a venue where people can also, bring the attention of the world to them, and at least have their opportunity to make their claims heard. So with that, I'm wondering,
Eric,
Carrie,
before you jump in, could I just ask you quickly? I know I don't want to say off topic. I think it's related, but it wasn't done through this process. Just a little bit about Martin versus Boise, because for me, as somebody who's formerly homeless and a homeless advocate, I think that underscores the amount of time it takes to make that change, but that change can be effective in the long run.
Yeah, no, we brought the case originally back in 2009, and it's been more than a decade. But in the middle of that process, in 2014, 2015, we were able to leverage the previous Universal Periodic Review and the consultations that the Obama administration was having, as they should be having now, in advance of that, to talk with government officials. And so it's not necessarily that we got any specific recommendation, although that was useful. It was just the opportunity to have a conversation about the issue of homelessness and criminalization of homelessness as a human rights issue with these top officials in the Department of Justice, and they were able to say to us, we hear you. We hear you, and we hear your call, and we hear the recommendation from the international level. What can we do to respond to this? Give us something. And we said, well, we've got, an active case going on right now in Boise, and could you submit a brief supporting our position in it? And 6 months later, that we got exactly that. And it changed, even that brief, that was not a ruling from the court, which we later got, but the way it was framed as this DOJ ruling changed a lot of policies immediately. Cities, overnight put moratoriums on their enforcement of these anti-camping laws. And I had a homeless gentleman in Portland, Oregon, come up to me and, just give me a giant hug. He had a copy of one of our human rights reports in one hand and a copy of the Bell at that time, v. Boise DOJ submission. And he said, this work got me my first night's decent sleep in 5 years. And that has changed everything for me. I can now go to sleep without being afraid of being woken up and just, harassed. And it's a physical thing, it's a health thing, and it's a dignity thing. And, so these things, it definitely does take a long time, but that's what movement building is. And then we're building a movement, and we're, the tide is kind of turning. So I'm wondering, Carrie, if you can talk a little bit more about, for groups who haven't been involved in the process so far, they've missed the opportunities to submit materials. The U.S. government hasn't had consultations, but, we've got the review coming up in a couple weeks. What could they do to use the opportunity of the review as an organizing, kind of hook, or to use the process and what comes out of it for their advocacy?
Okay, so there are a few things that people could still do. Leading up to the review, it's really important to draw attention to what's going on, because so much of the general public has no idea that this is even happening, right? So I think it would be great if people that have a certain amount of understanding of the process could even do things like write op-eds in their local papers, and just try to draw the public's attention to the fact that this is happening, that this international body is trying to hold the US accountable in some way. And definitely tune into the review, as I mentioned. And then after the review, we can do things like lobby the government to accept any recommendations that are made. We've got elections coming up, and well, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but if there's a new administration, then that administration could be open to our lobbying. If you are with an organization that has ECOSOC status, you can sign up to address the Human Rights Council during the plenary session that's going to be taking place when it adopts the report that comes out of the review. And organizations can deliver their statements by video. That's a possibility. Definitely, you can also write a written statement after the review takes place as well, to debrief and to inform people. And definitely just think about getting involved in the process leading up to the next review, right? It's a 5-year process. You advocate for legislation and other reforms to implement recommendations that were made, engage in consultations with the government, and monitor whether or not the implementation of the recommendations are taking place. And definitely collaborate with other organizations that are working on similar issues to try to push your issues forward. So those are some of the ways that you can get involved, not just in the short term, but in the long term.
No, I love that. Definitely some immediate steps, but the good thing about the UPR is we know it's going to happen every 5 years, and so if you felt like you weren't prepared this time around, you've got 5 years to prep for the next one, and a lot of groups here who you can talk to about how to do that. David, I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit more about how you kind of engaged with the local advocacy groups in Miami, and you mentioned some of the work, particularly around some of the CEDAW policies and things like that. But what are I know the activity that kind of the Human Rights Clinic has been doing itself, but are there any what are the organizers doing for their parts to take advantage of the process?
So I can tell you that we've definitely, that engaging people on it was a lot of educating advocacy groups on it. Not everybody knows the human rights system even exists or isn't in place. So I definitely think part of that process was really educating people on what a UPR is and how to engage with it. As for what other advocacy groups are doing, I'm not entirely sure on what all the advocacy groups in Miami are doing. It's definitely been our priority in our project, so we've been really pushing and leading the front on it, and we've been keeping our partners relatively informed on it. I believe that we have been taking actions now, like I mentioned, and sort of keeping them all involved. But again, I think that what we really wanted to do right now was sort of plant the seeds about the international community and working on the UPR process and how that could be a beneficial thing for advocates to engage in. And I think that now that advocates really understand it, once they've gone through the first UPR process and they've seen sort of how it works and what kind of recommendations that can come back, I think that we're in the run up to the next UPR process in 5 years that we'll have more support and more built-in engagement on it, and hopefully they'll see what we've already done this year, and we can have an even more successful, vibrant UPR cycle next time.
Yep. No, that sounds good. I know there's some organizers, for example, that are doing watch parties. The review will take place early in the morning on November 9th, but it'll be recorded, and so you can schedule it whenever it's convenient. But just as an opportunity to do more education, you could do a watch party for the review itself. It's not entirely the most thrilling thing, but you will get to see the U.S. presenting its human rights record, and some of the whitewashing it does to present the best face of indefensible policies to the world. And then you'll see all these other countries coming up, and the U.S. delegation having to sit there and hear questions and hear recommendations and critiques. And so it can be a really empowering process. And then, after you do that watch party, you can have conversations. What do we do with this? How can we use this for our local advocacy? So I'm hoping that things like that will start happening. I do have a question here about if there's any work being done in the school systems to engage young people in this kind of work. I don't know if Carrie or anybody else has anything they want to say about that.
Yeah, so I don't have any actual data on that, but I don't think so. I don't think so at all. And I think that's something that we really have to start pushing for. I mean, mind you, there's so many changes that I think people would like to see in the educational system here, but human rights education is a part of that, should be a part of that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
So, Eric, this is Rob. You've heard me. You've known me long enough to know that I've always talked about not learning about human rights until I went through what I call my transformation in life, right? Basically, after homelessness, having to do a brain dump and dump my head and relearn the world all over again, because nobody in school taught me about a standard document like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I keep in my back pocket as a standard, almost like my wallet, right? It's always in my back pocket. So I agree with Kerry that that's part of the foundation of this work. But I think it's a bigger picture, and you've also heard this from me. How do we institutionalize human rights thinking here? Because our government has been dismissive of it. And I think we on the ground sometimes have adopted that exceptionalist attitude, that it's something that happens over there or across that border. But, what does fascinate me now, when I first really, after the 2010 Universal Periodic Review, and to be on the streets now, when people in New York City are shutting down the housing courts and saying housing is a human right. They weren't saying that 10 years ago, right? And I think they really believe it now, and they're starting to understand what it means. And I'm also seeing legal people go into a courtroom and use the terminology in civil court in New York, and, almost putting judges in a stalemate, like, daring the judge to say, oh, you don't have human rights, right? Like, who wants to be that first judge to go on record saying that? But I do think, as Kerry said, we have a long way to go. It's something that we need to figure out, because what I've learned outside of the institution, the educational institution, had nothing to do with human rights. And all my human rights knowledge came from working on the ground, working in communities, and having access to people with that knowledge, which I often call a closed circle. And I think our charge is to widen that circle, right? Widen that circle and bring more people in. So.
Great. I think that's really useful. There was a question, just kind of a technical question on how we find out what agencies submitted reports for the upcoming review and where to access those. You want to take that, Carrie?
Yes. So it's on the UN website. So what I don't have the exact URL right now. So what I'd ask you to do, if you need answers to questions like that, you can visit our upr2020.org website. Okay, and then also from there, please feel free to send me an email. It's kmclean@ushrnetwork.org. It's also on our website, but we have a lot of information there that would be useful to you.
So again, I'll just follow up Carrie and say that's been something as a UPR task force that we've been discussing, how to create a central repository to store this stuff. Because if you go to the UN's website, you're getting lost in the sauce, man. You're going to be navigating for a while. So we know that it's difficult sometimes. So we've been thinking, beyond this universal periodic review, maybe some of our work leading up to the next is how do we build a central repository that's easily accessible for everybody, right? Yeah, we have the network right now, but I think it's incumbent upon those of us that are members of the network to support those efforts and really think through that process. What can we do to create that repository?
And I'll just add that in terms of saying, I'm not exactly sure what the questioner was referring to with what agencies, whether they were meaning like the federal agencies that were reporting as part of the official process, or the non-governmental organizations that submitted their reports. And so the federal agencies, they all put their information into one single report that the State Department sends, so that they kind of collect all of the information. And this should be where the consultation process comes in with non-governmental organizations as they think about, the economic and social rights issues, and are, having conversations with the folks at HUD and HHS and the Department of Labor, Department of Education, to give input into their report. They should also be talking to the members of civil society to say, to highlight their priorities and find out what's going on. But that didn't happen this time around. But all of that information went into one kind of big report from the federal government that went to the UN. And then you have all these 100+ submissions from non-governmental organizations. And the unfortunate thing about the UPR process is that the non-governmental submissions are actually due before the governmental submission, because the UN compiles those into a single report and summarizes them. And so we put in our reports a year plus ago, and then the review was supposed to happen in May, but the US didn't put in its report, as Carrie said, until August. So we just we didn't have a chance to see what the US said before we put in our reports. And so there's still, just now kind of we're figuring out what the US has said and how we can respond to it. And there's a real need to talk directly with the UN missions and others to correct the record, because what the Trump administration has said in there, distorts and whitewashes the real situation of human rights in the U.S. So that is another important piece. But you can
let's be clear, Eric. Though that report was useless, right? It said nothing, right? Like we have to say that, and if you can't, I will, right? It actually said nothing, right? It's really useless by the end of the day, right? After we all worked across the country to put in our reports, right, and compile some information, they could have at least, gleaned from that information and owned up to some of, these international violations. But it didn't even mention COVID, right? You're in the middle of it, and it doesn't even touch on COVID. So it's a weak report, to be honest.
Yes. No. Thanks for saying it bluntly. And then just the last piece is Rob had earlier mentioned uprinfo.org. It's upr-info.org, and unlike the UN's website, it's fairly straightforward, and you can kind of search for things and sort by different categories. And so in many cases it links you into the actual UN website, but it's an easier portal to learn about the process and to search through. So that's another resource, so you can see what our government has said, what the non-governmental organizations have said, what other countries have said to the U.S. All that information is there. It's a really great resource. And they have videos on the process as a whole. So if you're a local organization who's trying to educate other members of your community about this process and what it is and why it's important, we'll have this webinar recorded and you can find it afterwards, but they've got some great little short videos about what the process is and how to get involved and things like that. So that is all out there. Any other questions? Carrie, there's a question about if there's some sort of form letter or template op-ed that the U.S. Human Rights Network could put out to help educate people in their community, and be able to, so different folks can kind of personalize it to their own local situation, but have some of the info just there in standard form.
Wow, I'm really happy that someone asks that. That's great. I'm happy that someone wants to do that. So we don't have a template at the moment, but I can definitely develop one. Please just contact me, whomever asks the question, send me an email, and I'll follow up with you. And yeah, we'll do that. Absolutely, no problem.
Yeah, and for whoever, eventually it'll be up at upr2020.org, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And then we got another question. I think this has somewhat been answered, but what can members of the public do to advocate during the Universal Periodic Review? So, as Carrie said, there's, unless your organization has, well, during the review itself, there's nothing you can do. The conversation is just between the different governments, but there are things you can do before, and there are things you can do after. Submitting a formal report, advocating with other governments to get your questions and your recommendations made during the session. But once the actual session starts, it's kind of out of your hands. Unfortunately, you have to hope that the lobbying work you've done has made an impact on the countries, because they're the only ones who get to officially participate in the process. Is there anything you would want to add to that, Carrie or Rob or David?
You guys? Yeah, no, so I think everything that you just said, and I don't want to just repeat everything that I said in my presentation, but yes, so in the next couple of weeks at least, it's just I think raising awareness about the review taking place, and encouraging people to watch it, and after the review, trying to engage with the government to accept the recommendations. Those are some important ways to get involved.
Great. We had one last question so far. If anybody else has any questions, we're coming up to the end of our questions, but we still have a little more time. If anybody wants to add anything more to the box, do that now. But the question we have is, what can be done at the local level to bring this into rural communities where resources are scarce? Anybody have any suggestions on that?
It's always a tough question, Eric. I always look to community-based organizations to carry this work. So there are community-based organizations all over the country that are involved in human rights work. And I think the more you bring it into conversation, the more that folks will focus on that particular work, right? As I said earlier, it's not something we all talk about. It's not something we all care about. We've been dismissive of it, but we need to engage in those conversations. And I do think come January 1st, 40 million people are at risk of evictions in this country. So that language is going to ramp up. The UN Special Rapporteur, Balakrishnan Rajagopal, has made worldwide evictions one of his priority issues early on in his tenure. He started in May, and he's come out publicly.
Robert, seems like we got
press release saying he's going to focus on it. Well, a lot of us, it's up to us as raccoons, but our voices need to come up. So we need to talk about these issues.
Great. Any other questions? Please. Oh, we got one. We got one. Let's see here. As an advocate for children and families experiencing homelessness, I'm curious whether any specific impacts of homelessness on children have been addressed in any of the lobbying efforts to date. So I know for the national report that we did, we do address the specific issues of homelessness in education under the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, and are advocating for recommendations to increase funding for those programs. In terms of, and just in general, kind of advocating for a broader universal human right to housing and universal vouchers and things like that, in order to make sure that all families, with children, without children, individuals, everybody has access to the housing in which they need. So those are issues that we have raised at the international level, but they haven't been necessarily the focus of some of the work. David, did you address those issues at all in the Miami report?
Yeah, in our report, we talked actually about a collective in Miami. It was one of our partners called the Homie Collective, and they work very much on youth homelessness in Miami-Dade County, as well as youth LGBT homelessness in Miami-Dade County, because it's a very particular issue here. And so those are definitely things that were on our radar and actually took up a pretty good sized piece of it. And we had some specific recommendations that we had recommended on that. It's definitely an important thing to include and an important part of the topic.
Great. Carrie, you're off video, but I know you may have to leave early. Is there anything that we'll keep going as long as people need us to keep going? But is there anything you wanted to say before signing off?
Yeah, I'm still here for a few more minutes, and okay. I'm glad that question was asked. We have a working group at the network that's focused on the rights of children, and I'll talk with the person who's coordinating that working group and just make sure that that's an issue that's included. So thank you very much for that question.
Yeah, and so that I'll put the questioner in. I'll get her contact information to you, Carrie, so you can follow up directly and hopefully put her in touch with the working group.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Anything else that you wanted to add?
Oh, me specifically?
Yeah. Just I want to make sure that you do have time to say anything you felt like you haven't been able to say yet before you have to jump off.
No, I'm yeah, and I'll stick around.
Okay, great. Got another question. This is not exactly on the kind of human rights point, but about the city and county requesting a camp of 80 people experiencing homelessness to list their names for their files. Is it a legal request, and does it violate privacy rights? So there, I would say, if they are trying to collect that information so that they can get people into housing, I think that's a very legitimate request. We have seen a number of encampments now that have been closed down productively by actually getting people into housing, and that's while we don't advocate for encampments to be ripped down without places for other people to go or other places for people to go, we also don't want to see encampments stay there forever, because a camp is not a home. it can serve as a home in a temporary situation, but everybody deserves fully adequate indoor housing. And so if this is part of a city's attempt to actually do that in the right way, by getting people into housing, then I think that's the best practice, to find out who's there. You generate a by name list so that if somebody it's not just that you have 80 people in the encampment, but you have Joe, who is a veteran and can't go into a congregate shelter situation because it'll trigger his PTSD. So, that Joe needs an individual room. And if that becomes available, Joe gets it rather than somebody else who might not have those issues, who might be able to go into some other sort of living situation and have your resources really be able to be used effectively. So, in terms of, I don't know that it would be required for people to participate in that, but I think if they want to get access to those resources, I certainly think there's nothing wrong with the city asking, and in fact, it is part of a best practice to do these kind of by name list approaches. So, the advocate says it isn't related to getting them into housing. Well, then I don't know. We can definitely talk about that more offline. Are there any other questions? And while we wait for any final questions, David or Rob, if there's anything you want to say that you
Eric,
felt like.
I just follow up on that last question because it is also somewhat of a complicated issue, right? And the minute you start to collect information, people start yelling about surveillance. So there's that issue, right? But I do think data, if collected and distributed properly, can be used in an effective manner, as you laid out, right? So there are different reasons to collect data, and you really need to know what that central reason is. But you'll find folks getting into many different fights over collecting data, and all because the real reason wasn't revealed, right? And there are people that resist giving the information. There are people that are being forceful to collect it. But I think having conversations about the use of data up front and being transparent about it is the best approach with respect to data, because as you know, being involved in the continuum of care in New York, I was very much in favor of collecting data and counts on homeless folks, but that gave us insightful information on high rates of recidivism, of the problem not being addressed the proper way, right? So just seeing the number of people going from street homeless into transitional housing, not into permanent supportive housing, back into the street, back into emergency shelter, back into transitional housing. So it became sort of a merry-go-round. But collecting the data and understanding this process changed that process in an incredible way. So I think how you use the data is fundamental, being transparent about the collection of data, and being upfront about it. Then it depends. And then I think there's the other issue of, and you touched on this a little bit, but not, I don't think in this intentional way. As somebody who lived homeless, lived on the streets, I don't think it's the way to survive. But there are those that say, I want my freedom and I want to be out here. So we have to understand, that angle too, right? Like there's an argument to be made on that side. We're not going to always agree on this issue, right? It's an issue where you go through a lot of back and forth. So, making a presentation that's going to change can be hard sometimes with respect to street homeless folks.
Just as we wait for any final questions to come in, I'm going to do a quick poll here to ask if folks will use what they learned today in their own advocacy. And folks can just click on the little button on the screen, and we'll wait a minute or two for people to vote here. we recognize that a lot of this stuff is new for a lot of U.S. advocates, but we're definitely hoping that we are building the movement of people who are going to be talking about housing as a human right, who are going to be talking about some of these human rights standards, and whether or not you use it immediately or down the road, or you're actually participating in the U.S. Review through these UN mechanisms, or just simply changing the way you talk about it internally. All of that is definitely good and an advancement for the movement. So with that, I'll just close out the poll, and I'm happy to share that we got nobody saying that they wouldn't use it. A huge majority saying that yes, they will use it, and some people who aren't sure. So that's great news for the advancement of the movement.
Awesome.
Glad you're excited by that, Carrie, too. And then just in terms of building the movement, I'll also say that this crisis that we are in right now, in terms of COVID, in terms of racial disparities, is really forcing us to see that we are all interconnected, and without housing or sanitation or services, our neighbors who are on the front lines of this deadly pandemic, they will continue to be on that front line unless we continue our work towards lasting solutions. And the crisis has shown us that there are effective and inexpensive ways to provide housing as a human right. We've seen a lot of communities turning to hotel rooms in order to provide people with safe housing, and that's a result of the advocacy that we and others have done to make sure that people aren't being housed in unsafe conditions. But once people are in that housing, we got to make sure that they don't go back out to the streets, and that we are actually building a community that's going to be better, not just go back to the previous status quo, which was never accessible to begin with. And so I'll hope that folks would consider supporting the Law Center's work towards both immediate and more permanent solutions. So with that, we got one more question in the meantime, about successful methodologies to develop public-private partnerships to fund multi-housing communities, a national model that's been successful for this. I don't know, Rob, if you have anything that you would want to say there, but in terms of national models, we do have a number of reports on our website: our Housing Not Handcuffs report, our Tent City USA report, both of which have some case studies of successful models where communities have used both public dollars and private dollars to successfully get people out of encampments and into adequate housing. And right now, what we are seeing, as I just said, in a lot of communities, is the CARES Act dollars and FEMA money being used to aid the response, going to put people into hotel rooms, but that then those are being supported also by, in some cases, private entities, in some cases, other nonprofits. So to make sure that people are getting the adequate services that they need once they're in those hotel rooms. And in some cases, it's even been, hotels or other facilities actually volunteering their rooms since they're otherwise sitting vacant in order to be used for that. So yeah, there are definitely models out there. I'd encourage you to check out our reports. And I don't know, Rob, if you have anything you would want to add there or anything else.
Eric, I think we have to be careful on this issue. I'm always very selective when I think about public-private partnerships, but being involved in the delivery of homeless services in New York, I don't want to put any name out there, but if folks want to reach out to me directly, and Eric, you can put my email in the chat. I can certainly connect you with organizations that I think do a good job of that in New York, and particularly focusing on homeless services. There are a few, but I think we have to be careful of what these are, because when you start to say private, you start to think about profit, and sometimes motives get a little cloudy there. So I would just, be very careful about those that I promote with respect to public-private partnerships. But there are success models.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the message that housing is a human right is that you have to make sure that everybody has access to it. And that doesn't mean that it all has to be public dollars. It doesn't have to be all public housing or all vouchers, or, that every individual gets a single family home with a white picket fence around it for free. Like that's not what the right to housing means.
Right.
But it does mean, and so private partnerships could be part of that, and probably should be part of that. But it puts the responsibility ultimately on the government to make sure that it's met at the end of the day, and they can't shirk that and can't say, well, we don't have private partners stepping up, so unfortunately you can't do it. That's not going to be good enough. It has to be that the government is filling in the gaps for anybody who the system, the market isn't meeting their needs. And so, yeah, I think your word of caution is really well taken there. So yeah, and I will try to put your contact info in the chat, but otherwise, it's folks can feel free to follow up with us afterwards, and we will connect people as needed. But here we go. Does anybody else have any? It looks like we're running out of questions here and coming towards the end of our time. So anybody have any last remarks they want to make? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you to all of our co-presenters. You presented a huge amount of really useful information today. And I think we are on a rising wave, and we've started to change the conversation around housing, as I kind of started off saying. We've got it into federal agency materials. We've got people talking about it at the grassroots level. We've got presidential candidates talking about housing as a right for the first time in half a century. And so we've got a lot of work to do, but there's nowhere to go but up. So hope to be part of that movement with you. Please be in touch, and we will see you again. We are not doing our next, we've been doing bi-weekly webinars. We're not going to do one the day after the election for understandable reasons, but we will have an election debrief webinar coming up in 4 weeks. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, thank you, everybody, and let's go make housing a human right.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.